The Greely Expedition. Private Henry, by order of this command, you are to be executed. The words were thin as the frozen air at Cape Sabine. 3 soldiers, trembling from starvation, raised their rifles against their own comrade. The injustice was bitter. They were starving because a distant government had botched their rescue, leaving 25 men to rot for 3 years. But as the shots echoed, a darker secret began to unfurl. The dead were vanishing from their graves, and the meat in the pot tasted like something no human should ever name. The summer of 1881 didn't arrive with a thaw. It arrived with the groaning sound of the Proteus shoving its iron-shod bow against the white skin of the Arctic. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely stood on the deck, his spine stiff as a bayonet, watching the jagged coastline of Ellesmere Island emerge from the mist. He was a volunteer, a man of wires and signals, not a sailor. He was leading 24 men toward the absolute edge of the map, a place called Lady Franklin Bay. They were there for science, a global mission to map the heartbeat of the world's weather. But the injustice of the expedition was buried in the fine print of the Army's orders. Greely was a man of rules, yet he was being sent into a place where the only law was survival, backed by a bureaucracy that viewed these men as expendable chess pieces in a game of national pride. They established Fort Conger with the efficiency of a military parade. The men hauled wood, secured their scientific instruments, and began the grueling work of recording temperatures that would freeze mercury solid. The air in those early days was thick with a naive kind of triumph. They were the elite, the chosen few. They even pushed further north than any human had ever gone, snatching a 300-year-old record from the British. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated ego. They sat in the warmth of the fort, smoking pipes and laughing about the frozen wasteland outside their doors. But the Arctic is a patient predator. It doesn't scream. It just waits for the silence to settle. While Greely recorded the barometric pressure, the ice behind them was already knitting itself back together. A massive, white iron curtain falling between them and the world they knew. The human texture of the camp began to change as the first year bled into the second. The conversational hum of the barracks grew strained. Sergeant Brainerd, a man who moved with the quiet grace of a cat, spent his hours watching the southern horizon. The plan was simple: a relief ship in 1882, another in 1883. But 1,882 came and went, with nothing but the screaming of the wind. The curiosity loop began to tighten. Why hadn't the ship arrived? Had they been forgotten? The men started to pick at their cuticles, their eyes darting to the door every time the wind howled a bit louder. The gossip among the rank and file was hushed. "The ice is too thick this year," some whispered. "The brass back home doesn't care about a bunch of frozen soldiers," others muttered. Greely kept his face a mask of iron, but his fingers trembled when he signed the daily logs. When the summer of 1883 arrived and the horizon remained empty, the tone shifted from annoyance to cold, sharp dread. The Proteus, the ship sent to save them, had been crushed by the ice floes like a walnut in a vise. It sank in minutes, taking its thousands of pounds of coal and food to the bottom of the sea. Greely didn't know this yet. He only knew that the calendar was his enemy. He made the fateful decision to abandon the relative safety of Fort Conger and retreat south. It was a desperate gamble. He believed that if they could reach Cape Sabine hundreds of miles to the south, they would find a massive cache of food waiting for them. They abandoned the fort, dragging heavy sledges across the grinding, shifting ice. The retreat was a masterclass in slow-motion agony. The men hauled hundreds of pounds of gear over pressure ridges that looked like jagged glass. Their boots were soaked, their toes blackening with frostbite that felt like needles being driven into the bone. The injustice was staggering. These men were doing everything right, following every order. Yet the geography was conspiring to erase them. The human texture of the retreat was the sound of heavy breathing, the smell of unwashed bodies in damp wool, and the rhythmic clack of the sledges hitting the ice. They were no longer soldiers of science. They were pack animals, moving toward a promise of food that felt more like a mirage with every passing mile. As they reached the southern coast, the ice became a labyrinth. They were trapped on a floe for weeks, drifting aimlessly, while the wind whipped the salt spray into their faces. The pacing of the disaster was deliberate. It wasn't a sudden fall. It was a gradual losing of ground. They were forced to kill their sled dogs for meat, a psychological blow that hit harder than the cold. The dogs were their only link to the living world, and now they were just calories. The curiosity loop remained open. What would they find at Cape Sabine? Greely kept the men moving with the promise of the cache. He spoke of it as if it were a holy relic. Tons of beef, bread, and sugar. It was the only thing keeping them from lying down in the snow and letting the white sleep take them. By the time the dark cliffs of Cape Sabine loomed out of the fog in October 1883, the men were shadows. Their skin was the color of old parchment, and their eyes were sunken deep into their skulls. They scrambled ashore, their hands raw and bleeding, searching for the markers of the supply depot. The human texture was a frantic, desperate scrabbling in the frozen earth. They found the cairn. They found the letters left by the failed relief expeditions. But they didn't find the mountain of food Greely had promised. Instead, they found a meager pittance, enough to last 25 men, maybe a month. The relief ship had been wrecked, and the crew had fled south, leaving only the scraps they could save. The revelation hit the men with the force of a physical strike. There was no rescue coming. The winter was closing in, and they were stranded on a barren, windswept rock with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few sacks of moldy hardtack. The injustice was complete. They had followed the plan to the letter, and the plan had abandoned them. Greely stood on the shoreline, the wind tearing at his beard, looking out at the freezing black water. He realized then that he wasn't just a commander anymore. He was a warden of a graveyard. The curiosity loop for the first act closes with a chilling realization. They aren't waiting for a ship. They are waiting for the end. The men began to build a shelter, a miserable hovel made of stones and the remains of their wooden boat. They called it Camp Clay, but it was a tomb. They crawled inside, shoulder to shoulder, trying to share the dwindling heat of their dying bodies. The atmospheric pressure Greely had spent years measuring was now pressing down on them, a physical weight of despair. The first act ends with the sun dipping below the horizon for the final time that year, plunging the expedition into a 4-month night. The last thing the men heard before the winter silence took hold was the sound of the ice locking the bay shut, a final metallic click of a door being bolted from the outside. The winter of 1883 didn't just bring the dark. It brought a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the stone walls of their hovel. They called it Camp Clay, a miserable pile of rocks and frozen mud topped with the remains of their whaleboat. Inside, 25 men lay shoulder to shoulder in the pitch black. The human texture of the hut was a nightmare of sensory deprivation. The air was a thick, stagnant soup of unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of scurvy, and the sweet, sickly scent of rotting feet. Every time a man exhaled, the moisture from his breath hit the ceiling and froze instantly, forming a canopy of jagged rime that occasionally shattered and fell onto their faces like glass. They were living in a refrigerator, counting the minutes by the rhythmic, shallow gasps of their comrades. The conversational hum of the first act had died, replaced by a series of desperate, whispered questions. "Is the sun ever coming back, Sarge?" Private Henry would ask into the dark. No one answered. The curiosity loop had shifted from the hope of a ship to the math of the stomach. They were down to 5 ounces of moldy bread and a smear of canned beef a day. Greely, his eyes sunken into his skull until they looked like burnt holes in a blanket, tried to maintain military discipline. He insisted on morning reports. He insisted on scientific observations. But it's hard to care about the barometric pressure when your teeth are loose in your gums from malnutrition. The injustice was the proximity of their death. They were only a few hundred miles from civilization, yet they might as well have been on the moon. The pacing of the starvation was a slow-motion car crash. First, the fat disappeared, leaving their skin hanging in gray folds. Then, the muscles began to wither, making every movement a Herculean effort. By midwinter, the first man went. Sergeant Cross died quietly in his sleeping bag. The men didn't have the strength to dig a grave in the iron-hard permafrost, so they dragged him to a nearby ridge and covered him with a few stones. The momentum of the camp changed after that. Death was no longer a possibility. It was a roommate. The gossip became darker, focused on the extra rations. Someone was stealing. Someone was trading their boots for a piece of hardtack. The trust that had held them together at Fort Conger was evaporating, leaving behind a raw, primal desperation. The escalation of the conflict centered on Private Henry. He was a massive man, the strongest in the group, and he seemed to be failing slower than the others. The curiosity loop tightened. How was he staying so strong? The answer was a punch to the gut. He was caught red-handed stealing from the meager mess chest, in a place where a single biscuit was the difference between life and death. Theft was murder. Greely faced a horrific choice. He was a man of the law, and the law in the Arctic was brutal. He issued a written order for Henry's execution. The human texture of that moment was devastating. 3 men, barely able to stand, bracing themselves against the wind as they fired into their comrade. There was no trial, just the sharp crack of a rifle and one less mouth to feed. The sensory details of the camp grew more grotesque as the food ran out entirely. They began to eat shrimp, which were actually tiny, translucent sea lice they caught in traps made of old burlap. They tasted like salt and rot. They boiled their sealskin boots until the leather turned into a gray, gelatinous slime. They scraped the black lichen off the rocks, a substance that gave them agonizing stomach cramps, but offered a few hollow calories. The injustice was the silence of the horizon. Every day, Sergeant Brainerd would crawl to the top of the ridge, his hands raw and bleeding, to look for a sail. Every day, he saw nothing but the indifferent, white expanse of the sea. The men began to hallucinate, speaking to wives and mothers who weren't there. Their voices thin and reedy, like the wind. The tension reached its peak as the dead list grew. One by one, the men stopped talking. The silence would start in the feet and move up to the heart. When a man died, the survivors would strip him of his clothes, anything, to keep the remaining heartbeats going. The human texture of these moments was a study in micro-movements. The trembling hands of a friend unbuttoning a dead man's coat, the quiet apology whispered into the cold. But a darker escalation was brewing. As the lice traps came up empty and the lichens grew scarce, the survivors began to look at the bodies on the ridge not as comrades, but as a last resort. The curiosity loop was a terrifying one. How far would a man go to see the sun one more time? The bystander gossip among the men turned into a series of coded glances. No one spoke the word cannibalism aloud, but the smell of wood smoke from the small cooking fire began to carry a different scent. Greely, drifting in and out of a fever, tried to keep his eyes closed to the reality of the ridge. The momentum of their humanity was slipping away, replaced by the cold, hard logic of the carnivore. They were no longer an expedition. They were a pack of ghosts. The injustice of their situation was a screaming void. They had been sent to map the world, and now the world was consuming them. As the second act ends, the 4-month night finally breaks. A weak, gray sliver of sun hits the rocks of Cape Sabine. But there is no cheering. Only 7 men are left alive. They are huddled under a collapsed tent, the stone hut having become too full of the dead to inhabit. They are too weak to move, too weak to even brush the snow from their faces. The curiosity loop for Act 2 closes on a scene of utter desolation. They have reached the end of their endurance. The wind howls through the tattered canvas, and the men close their eyes, waiting for the final cold. But in the distance, past the grinding ice and the white fog, a new sound begins to rise, the low, rhythmic throb of a steam engine. The rescue was not a grand celebration. It was a scene from a charnel house. On the 22nd of June, 1884, the relief ships Thetis and Bear finally battered through the ice at Cape Sabine. When Captain Winfield Schley stepped onto the shore, He didn't find the proud military outpost he had expected. He found a collapsed tent, flapping like a broken wing in the gale. Inside, 7 men were huddled together, so far gone that they didn't even cheer when they heard the rescuers' voices. They looked like skeletons wrapped in translucent parchment, their eyes wide and glassy, staring at a world they had already left behind. The human texture of the rescue was harrowing the sailors who came to save them. Hardened men of the sea openly wept at the sight. They had to lift the survivors like brittle dolls, terrified that their bones would snap under the weight of a blanket. The injustice of the mission's end hit the public immediately. As the ships turned south, the story of the farthest north was quickly eclipsed by a darker truth. The curiosity loop that had sustained the men through the winter, the question of how they had survived, began to unravel in the most horrific way possible. As the rescuers prepared the bodies of the deceased for transport back to America, the medical officers made a discovery that would stain the expedition's legacy forever. The flesh had been neatly, surgically carved from the bones of several of the dead. The silence of the Arctic had been broken by the ultimate taboo. The realization landed with a sickening emotional punch. The survivors hadn't just endured the cold, they had consumed their comrades to stay alive. The momentum of the journey home was a blur of scandal and grief. When the ships docked in New York, the survivors weren't greeted as conquering heroes, but as ghouls. The press, sensing a blood trail, began a relentless interrogation of the camp of the dead. The bystander gossip was poisonous. They ate their own, the headlines screamed. The families of the deceased, already broken by the loss of their sons, now had to reckon with the idea that their loved ones had been served as a desperate meal. The injustice felt by the survivors was equally sharp. They had been abandoned by their government for 3 years, left to rot on a barren rock, and now they were being judged for the primal mechanics of survival. Greely himself became the focal point of the storm. He was the underdog who had kept his men alive long past any reasonable expectation. Yet he was now the man who had to explain the unexplainable. The human texture of his return was one of stoic, haunted silence. He never denied the horrors of Cape Sabine, but he never wallowed in them either. He focused on the data, the thousands of pages of meteorological observations, the maps of the unknown coastlines, the records of a world no one else had seen. He tried to prove that the sacrifice, no matter how gruesome, had bought something valuable for humanity. The pacing of his rehabilitation was slow. It took decades for the public to move past the scandal and see the man who had maintained order in the mouth of hell. The legacy of the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition is a jagged scar on the history of exploration. It changed the way the military handled Arctic missions, leading to better logistics and a deeper respect for the lethal nature of the ice. But for the 7 survivors, the aftermath was a lifelong haunting. They lived in a world that could never understand the conversational logic of a starving brain. The curiosity loop closes on the image of Greely, years later, being awarded the Medal of Honor on his 91st birthday. He had become a major general, a titan of the Signal Corps, but when he closed his eyes, he was likely still back in that stone hut, listening to the rhythmic tapping of the wind against the whaleboat roof. The story concludes with a final look at Cape Sabine. The stone walls of Camp Clay have long since collapsed into the tundra. The Lichen Island, where they buried their friends, is once again a silent, windswept rock. The emotional weight of the expedition isn't found in the records or the medals, but in the silence that remains. The underdog story of the Greely Expedition is a reminder that we are only as civilized as our last meal, and that the thin veneer of our humanity is easily stripped away by a northern wind. The final image is the sun setting over Lady Franklin Bay, casting long, bloody shadows over the ice that once held 25 men and only gave back 7. Adolphus Greely went to the Arctic to map the wind, but he ended up mapping the darkest corners of the human soul. If this journey into the camp of the dead gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of survival at the edge of the map. Tell us in the comments, could you judge a man for what he did to survive 250 days in total darkness? Your thoughts help keep these forgotten histories alive. Until next time, remember that the ice never forgets. The Greely Expedition reminds us that the thin line between civilization and the unthinkable is often just a few missed meals. If this descent into the camp of the dead moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories history tried to bury. Drop a comment below. Do you think Greely was a hero for keeping 7 men alive? Or a failure for losing 18? Your engagement helps us keep these forgotten chronicles alive. Disclaimer: the following program is produced for entertainment purposes only. While the Greely Expedition is based on the historical records of the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition, 1881–1884, certain dialogue, pacing, and narrative descriptions have been dramatized to enhance the viewing experience. This content is intended for storytelling and should not be used as a primary source for academic research, legal testimony, or survival training. Viewers interested in the factual historical record are encouraged to consult the official National Archives or published memoirs of the survivors.